The skies over New York City were gray, thick with tension, not clouds. It was June 16th, 2025. The world had gathered for what the media called the last hope, an emergency UN Global Peace Summit after a series of deadly conflicts in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Inside the UN General Assembly Hall, the seats were full. Presidents, prime ministers, kings, rebels, survivors. And for the first time since leaving office, Donald J. Trump walked in with the same swagger, uninvited, but unbothered. Then came the man everyone was waiting for, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, in his desert-colored uniform, eyes focused, jaw tight. The room stilled. As Traoré stepped to the podium, Trump leaned forward with a half-smile. And without warning, Traoré paused, looked directly at Trump from the world stage, and said the 5 words that would break the internet. "You are not welcome here." Silence. The room froze. Cameras didn't blink. Translators stopped. But Traoré's eyes didn't move. This wasn't a soundbite. This was history breaking open. And no one knew what was about to unfold next. The sound of those 5 words, "You are not welcome here," echoed through the marble walls like a cannon in a cathedral. Trump shifted in his seat, trying to smile it off. But no one was laughing. Not the African presidents, not the Asian delegates, not even the European leaders. Traoré stood still, hands behind his back, not blinking. He continued, "For decades, we have suffered under your policies. Your decisions have stolen our futures. You didn't come here to help. You came to rewrite the story. But this time, Africa writes the script." Cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, stone cold. But underneath that, something flickered. Confusion, maybe fear. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman in a blue scarf, a Sudanese refugee delegate, started crying. She had lost 3 sons to drone strikes she believed were authorized during Trump's term. And now, the man she blamed sat 30 feet away. A young delegate from Mali whispered, "He's doing it. Traoré is saying what the world has buried for years." But what made Traoré's words powerful wasn't anger. It was truth, unfiltered, unapologetic, and too heavy to ignore. And the moment wasn't over. It had just begun. Hours before the summit, no one knew this confrontation was coming. Traoré had flown in under heavy security. Western media called him unpredictable, but they had no idea what he carried in his breast pocket. A letter from a grieving mother in Niger. Her 8-year-old daughter, Aisha, had died in a collapsed school after American corporations pulled funding in retaliation for Traoré's anti-West stance. The mother had written, "Captain, they may call you dangerous, but to us, you are the only man who listened. Please don't let Aisha be forgotten." Traoré carried her pain like a mission, and when he saw Trump sitting with his chin raised, as if above it all, he remembered Aisha's letter. That was the moment. That's when he said it. "You are not welcome here." But the real storm was coming. After the session closed, Trump demanded a private meeting with Traoré. He wanted answers, and he wouldn't leave without a confrontation. The global media swarmed. Twitter caught fire. Western analysts called it disrespect. But across Africa, something else happened. Hope awakened. The world didn't know it yet. But power had started to shift. The cameras were off now. But the tension? Still thick, like war before the first shot. Inside a heavily guarded conference room at the UN, Donald Trump stood face-to-face with Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Only 2 aides were present. No translators, no media. Trump leaned in and hissed, "You humiliated me on live television. You'll regret that." Traoré didn't flinch. Regret is for those who lie to the weak, not for those who stand with them. Trump's fist clenched. But Traoré pulled out the letter from Aïcha's mother, slowly unfolding it. He didn't raise his voice. He simply read the first line. "My child died choking on dust, where your empire planted silence." Trump turned away, but the words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral fire. No yelling, no insults, just one man's pain and another's refusal to accept it. That night, while world leaders dined and laughed upstairs, Traoré sat alone, staring out the window at the city that had ruled so many, and whispered to himself, "Africa's silence ends with me." The next morning, Traoré visited a local African community center in the Bronx. Security begged him not to go. His advisors warned of Western traps. But he went anyway. There, standing near the dusty stage, was a 12-year-old girl named Naya, wearing a torn Burkinabe flag as a scarf. She'd never been to Burkina Faso. Her parents fled during a military raid. But she'd seen Traoré on TikTok and called him her hero. When he stepped through the door, she ran into his arms and burst into tears. "You told the whole world we matter." She gave him a handmade bracelet with the word truth on it. Traoré, a battle-hardened soldier, wiped his eyes. The moment wasn't staged. No journalists, no cameras, just a child hugging a symbol of her homeland's voice. But someone in the room filmed it quietly. That video would soon go viral, with the caption, "While they mock him, our children believe in him." That night, even critics paused, because suddenly, this wasn't politics anymore. It was personal. It was real. And the world was watching with new eyes. Day 3 of the summit. Cameras back on, microphones live. Traoré stepped up again, not to argue, but to propose a global humanitarian pact where Africa would lead. CNN, BBC, and other major networks aired his speech live, at first. But halfway through his words, as he described the invisible theft of African resources, CNN cut the feed. "Due to unexpected technical issues, we'll return shortly," the anchor said with a nervous smile. Viewers were furious. Twitter erupted. "They're silencing him in real time. What are they hiding? Let the man speak." But the speech was still broadcasting, on African and independent media channels, and millions tuned in. Traoré's words echoed, "We do not seek pity. We demand partnership, real partnership. And if we must lead ourselves alone, then so be it." His voice cracked, not from nerves, but from the weight of generations. Meanwhile, across the U.S., African immigrants wept watching from living rooms and dorms. One young woman tweeted, "I didn't know I needed to hear this. I didn't know we were allowed to speak like this." This wasn't just a speech anymore. It was a resurrection of forgotten dignity. 2 hours before his next UN address, Traoré collapsed in his hotel suite. Panic spread. His staff rushed to him. His pulse was fading. For a moment, it looked like the story would end in tragedy. Emergency responders arrived in minutes. But it wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't stress. His tea had been poisoned. Doctors later found a slow-acting neurotoxin, one common in Cold War assassinations. It was slipped into his drink after his visit to the Bronx. The news leaked. Headlines read, "Traoré targeted in suspected assassination attempt." Global silence grows louder. But as his body struggled, something else happened. Millions of people across Africa gathered to pray. Mosques, churches, streets. From Lagos to Bamako, people lit candles and sang his name. And in a dim hospital room, with IVs in his arms, Traoré opened his eyes and whispered, "Let them come. I'm still standing." He had survived wars, betrayals, and coups. This was another scar. But this time the world had seen the attack and stayed silent. Except for one unexpected voice. The world was still holding its breath when a shocking video surfaced, leaked by a Western whistleblower. The man, former CIA analyst named Mark Leland, He looked straight into his webcam and spoke like he was confessing to murder. I was part of the operations designed to destabilize Traoré's movement. We framed him. We fed lies to the media. But after what I saw at the UN, I couldn't live with it anymore. He named names. He named companies. He named American officials who greenlit drone strikes, oil block seizures, and propaganda campaigns to silence African voices. And worst of all, the poisoning wasn't random, he said. It was ordered. The internet broke. Hashtags surged. We stand with Traoré. Truth for Africa. Your empire exposed. The UN went into emergency mode. The US delegation refused to comment, but the damage was done. Because for the first time, a Western insider had admitted what Africans had screamed for decades. And Traoré, now recovering in a wheelchair, addressed the press with fire in his eyes. Truth has no borders, and now it has no chains. Inside the UN chamber, during a hushed emergency session, an American diplomat rose to speak. Her name, Angela Moore, U.S. Deputy Ambassador to the UN. She looked around at the sea of skeptical eyes. Then at Traoré, who sat quietly in a wheelchair, watching her with the calm of a man who'd seen too much. Her voice cracked. I came here today to represent my government, but I'm speaking now as a mother and as a human being. She paused. Tears welled up. I watched that child, Naya, with the torn flag. I watched the footage of Aicha's school in ruins. I read the whistleblower's confession, and I asked myself, what have we done? The room went still. Captain Traoré, I apologize, not as a diplomat, as a woman who finally sees. And then, she did something unthinkable. She stepped off the podium and walked to Traoré, bowed her head and said softly, I believe you, and I stand with you. A single clap started from the African delegation, then more, until the chamber erupted in applause, except for the Western Bloc who sat frozen like relics of a crumbling order. And just like that, Traoré was no longer alone. Just when the world began to rally around Traoré, the knife came from behind. That morning, an African leader, President Mamadou Bako of Senegal, a man once seen as Traoré's ally, announced a joint development deal with U.S. oil companies. The press release claimed Traoré's extreme rhetoric was driving Africa toward isolation. Traoré watched the announcement in silence, his hands folded. But inside, his heart cracked. This was the man who once called him brother, who stood beside him after the 2022 ECOWAS fallout, who swore he'd never bow. Now, he had sold Africa's voice for profit. That evening, Bako entered the UN dining hall with Western diplomats, laughter, wine, cameras. And just beyond the velvet ropes, an intern from Ghana whispered into her phone, "He's smiling like he didn't just betray an entire continent." The video went viral overnight. Africans across the world weren't just angry, they were heartbroken. Because this time, it wasn't colonialism, it was greed from their own soil. And as betrayal spread across headlines, Traoré retreated into silence, but only for a moment, because he had one final card left to play. It came in a worn envelope, marked private, sent through South African diplomatic mail, no return address, delivered by an aging archivist with shaking hands. Inside was a yellowing letter, dated 1994, written by Nelson Mandela. The message had never been published, sealed for future African leaders. The final lines read, "There will come a time when the world pretends your courage is rebellion. When your voice shakes empires, they will try to silence it. When they do, remember, you do not need permission to be free. You only need the will to remain unbroken." Traoré read it 3 times, in silence. His fingers trembled. He looked out the window, tears filling his eyes, not of weakness, but of sacred responsibility. That night he returned to the summit, not as a politician, but as a living echo of the greats. He opened the Mandela letter on stage and read it aloud to the entire UN assembly. Some scoffed, some wept, but all listened. Because now history was speaking through him, and even the cameras dared not cut away. Back home in Burkina Faso, the people had reached their breaking point. News of the poisoning, the betrayal, and the media blackout had spread like wildfire. The youth were restless, the old were awake. On a humid morning, tens of thousands flooded the streets of Ouagadougou, young and old, barefoot and uniformed, carrying signs that read, "We are all Traoré. Africa will not kneel again. You poisoned our president, but not our spirit." Women beat drums, elders marched with canes, children held hand-painted flags. At the center of it all stood a widow named Mariam, whose son died in a NATO raid years ago. She wore white. She held up a photo of Traoré. When asked why she marched, she whispered, "Because no one has ever bled for us the way he has." Drones filmed the protest. The footage swept across global screens. And suddenly, world opinion began to shift. Not because of policy, but because of people. Traoré's body may have been weakened, but in Burkina Faso, his spirit had become a storm. It came in a white envelope marked confidential and delivered to the Burkinabe delegation's hotel at midnight. Inside, a letter from the United States Department of State. Cease your anti-Western rhetoric immediately. Withdraw from the summit. If you continue to disrupt diplomatic order, your country's financial assets will be frozen. Military assistance will be revoked. Burkina Faso will be isolated. At the bottom, 5 cold words. This is your final warning. Traoré sat still. The room around him buzzed with panic. Advisors begged him to back down, to survive. But Traoré rose from his chair and whispered, "Let them freeze the banks. They cannot freeze our voice." He took the letter, walked to the balcony, and set it on fire. Aide-de-camp Moussa watched silently as the flames curled and died. "Captain, are you ready for what comes next?" he asked. Traoré didn't answer immediately, then softly, like a man walking into storm winds, "I was born in chains. I will die on my feet." That night, Western diplomats quietly began packing their bags, because they knew something irreversible was coming. In a move no one predicted, 6 African nations walked out of the summit, not in protest, but in unity. Guinea, Mali, Chad, Congo, Niger, Eritrea. One by one, their leaders refused U.S. offers, condemned the sabotage of Traoré, and signed a single-page declaration titled, "The Pact of Dignity." The pact wasn't political. It was spiritual, cultural, existential. It called for Pan-African defense cooperation, joint resource ownership, media independence from Western conglomerates, and above all, the freedom to speak without punishment. CNN called it reckless. BBC called it the start of a new Cold War. But across Africa, crowds poured into the streets like it was a festival. Flags waved, mothers wept, students danced. In Ghana, an elder shouted on a megaphone, "The chains have broken. Africa rises with her own voice." Traoré, still recovering, stood in the back of the UN chamber as the pact was read aloud. He didn't smile. He cried, silently, tears running down his scarred cheeks. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the only one fighting anymore. On the last day of the summit, Captain Ibrahim Traoré requested 5 minutes of global airtime. The UN hesitated. The US objected. But the pressure was too great. Millions were watching, even more waiting. And when the cameras turned on, Traoré rolled himself to the podium, still in a wheelchair. The hall fell into total silence. He looked tired but unshaken. And then, without a script, he began. To the mothers who lost children to bombs they didn't understand. to the students whose futures were auctioned off by men in suits, to the continents told they were nothing without aid. He paused. His voice cracked. I came here not to ask, but to remind you. We are not waiting for seats at your table. We are building our own. If that terrifies you, then finally you understand. He pulled out Aicha's letter, held it to the camera. This is who I speak for, not governments, not corporations, but the buried voices. Then he stood, with shaking legs, and saluted the world. One final act of defiance. The room didn't clap, it wept. 2 days after Traoré's final speech, the West responded. Quietly, brutally. The World Bank suspended aid to Burkina Faso. Sanctions rained down. Burkinabe accounts abroad were frozen. Western media launched an assault of character attacks, calling Traoré a madman, dictator, threat to global stability. CNN aired edited clips to make him seem violent. New York Times ran a headline, Africa's strongman, the dangerous rise of Ibrahim Traoré. But back in Burkina Faso, there were no riots, no anger, just silence. A deep, grieving silence. Because Traoré had vanished. No press releases, no convoy, no last words. His aides said only, he left to protect the nation. He will return when the fire is ready. Across the continent, people lit candles and wore black. In Ouagadougou, Mariam the widow stood alone in the square and whispered, they couldn't kill him, so they erased him. Or so they thought. Because the next day, a video appeared on every screen in Africa, and everything changed. The video was simple. A black screen, one line of white text. If you see this, it means they tried to silence me. Then, Traoré's face, filmed in a quiet forest. No soldiers, no suit, just a man, and a camera. His voice, calm, powerful. If I disappear, do not weep. If I die, do not bury me in sadness. Bury me in your courage. Let every village, every slum, every border know Africa no longer whispers. Africa roars. He paused, then added, don't wait for me. Become me. That video hit 800 million views in 48 hours. People played it at weddings, funerals, rallies. Kids recited his words like scripture. Street artists painted his face on walls across cities. And for the first time in modern history, a leader didn't become a symbol after death. He became one while alive, hidden but everywhere. 1 year later, on June 16, 2026, the very date Traoré had defied Trump on the world stage, an enormous protest turned into something else entirely. In every African capital, people marched holding one item, a new flag, black, green, gold, and red, with one word in the center, dignity. No countries, no tribes, just Africans. And in Ouagadougou, under gray skies, little Naya, now 13, stood where Traoré once spoke. She held up his old military jacket and shouted, they can take his body, but not his voice. And as if destiny itself was watching, the clouds parted. Sunlight hit the crowd, and someone in the back began to sing, We are Traoré. Soon, thousands joined. That chant spread across the continent, and then around the world. Because power had changed hands, forever. If you felt something, anything, if your heart pounded, if you cried, if you believed for just one moment that courage like this still lives, click that like button. Drop a comment below. Let the world know what part touched you. Subscribe if you believe that stories like this matter. Stories of truth, dignity, and courage. Let's not just watch history, let's make it, together. Because somewhere out there, Traoré is watching us too.